So let's begin with a question after everything we've seen so far. What are the two outcomes for human beings? And a lot of people would say heaven or hell. So eternal happiness or eternal suffering. And that's a common picture. Never mind the fact that the gift of God is eternal life. But I guess that could be the gift of eternal life in eternal conscious punishment. Anyway, that's the common picture. And now we come to the Gospel of John. And John does something remarkable. He doesn't give us a long explanation, and he doesn't really build a system. He reduces things down to a single contrast. So let's read his most famous verse very clearly. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Now pause. Let's not rush through this part, because the verse is doing something very precise that will help us. It gives two outcomes, not 5, not 10, no complicated categories. It just gives us two. One is eternal life. Okay. And the other is eternal perishing. So it's life versus perishing, and certainly not flames of torment and asking for a drip of water and hanging out with Abraham. So let's get into what perish means here. So maybe perish means eternal conscious punishment. Maybe it does. Or does it mean to be destroyed, to come to an end, to cease living? Because in normal language, this is not a complicated word. If something perishes, it dies. If a person perishes, they die. If your food from the market is perished, you're not going to touch it, you're not going to eat it. But sometimes people say, well, perish here means a little something different. And I would say, but, let's just use the word, let's just read it as it stands. Let's read it literally. But John does this again. He doesn't just do it here. Kind of made it sound that way, but he doesn't just do it here. This life versus death versus perishing, we can also find in John 5:28 and 29. All who are in the graves will hear his voice and come out. Now notice that. Where are they? In the graves, in the ground, in Sheol, not already in heaven, not down there in hell, not in the bosom of Abraham with a great valley between them, in the graves. And that matches everything we've seen until now. Death goes into the grave, waiting in the grave, and then from the grave to resurrection and to judgment. And this is exactly what we saw in Job and Isaiah and Daniel. And John says some come out to life and others to judgment. But again, here, the key moment is not death at the moment of death. It's at resurrection. And John reinforces this in John 11:25. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. What he does not say is, I'm the one who keeps your soul alive after death. No, he says the resurrection and the life. And that's the focus. So think about that. If people already had eternal life by their, inherent nature, then this promise would not be meaningful. But John represents eternal life as something given, something then received, something that not everyone has. Only those who believe receive eternal life. Therefore, those who do not believe do not receive eternal life. But eternal conscious punishment is eternal life. You're just uncomfortable. So what is John's answer to that? He says, they perish. So it's not eternal life in another form. John doesn't say they live forever in suffering. He doesn't say, oh, they live a different kind of eternal life. He says they perish. And luckily, John didn't read Dante, which is where many people get their ideas of eternal conscious punishment from. Now, if you think back to everything we've studied, so Genesis, death, the Psalms talked about no knowledge, Ecclesiastes, no thought, no awareness. Job talks about waiting and a resurrection. Daniel clearly talks about resurrection. And Jesus talks about destruction. And now John, on top of all that, talks about life and perishing. And so all the pieces fit together. And this all matters because if the alternative to eternal life is perishing, then the traditional picture just doesn't hold water. The issue isn't, will you live forever? The issue is, will you live forever at all? And that actually changes the whole framing of the gospel. So it's not, how do I avoid hell, eternal conscious punishment? How do I avoid torment? But how do I receive eternal life? So now we have the nature of man, the reality of death, the state of the dead, the hope of resurrection, bodily resurrection, and the warning of judgment. And now the simplest possible contrast of life and perishing, life or death. The wages of sin is eternal conscious mind. The wages of sin is death if you don't have Christ. But there's one more voice we need to hear about this. There's just a couple more of these that we need to go through to really close it off, and that is the voice of Paul. And Paul will take everything we've got and state it in some really very, very clear ways so that we cannot miss it. And when he does, he will say something that is simple and profound. So here's your question to carry forward until next time. If eternal life is a gift, what is the true opposite of that gift? And that's what we will explore next time. And until then, God bless.